So Llano has really been ramping up their presence in the laptop cooling pad space over the last year. Their flagship V12 model for 15 to 19-inch laptops, which features a large turbo booster fan with a diameter of 5.5 inches, is one of the best sellers and top rated in its category on Amazon, despite it coming in at a higher price tag than more traditional options such as my old school Cooler Master Ultra Slim, which right now is coming in at about $30. But if you wouldn't have guessed just by eyeballing the two side by side, the V12 is a much more capable and feature-rich device, and its performance ceiling, which we'll get into, is a lot higher. And before we dive in on the V12 or the recently released V10 model for 13 to 17-inch laptops, I'm just going to say right off the bat that if you're spending hundreds, if not thousands, on a high-power gaming laptop, an additional $100 or less if you opt for non-RGB is nothing when you consider the potential damage from excessive heat around your motherboard, your CPU, your GPU, and other vital components that help your system run. And I appreciate the fact that Llano is standing behind these products with a 30-month warranty protection plan. Now, CPUs like the Intel i9-14900HX that Lenovo uses for both the 2024 7i and the Legion 9i are very strong performers, but they also can run very hot if you aren't careful. And this really comes into play when you're playing exclusively plugged in on high settings with demanding AAAs. Well, that's where these bad boys come in. The V12 and the V10 cooling pads give you an unparalleled level of control over your temps during heavy load. This design with a deep-seated fan, high walls, and memory foam pad creates somewhat of a vacuum when your laptop is placed on top, and the weight of the laptop causes it to sink into the memory foam, which creates a seal that prevents dust and airborne particles from seeping in through the underside of the laptop. And there's a cloth film that covers the fan of the pad itself, which helps with keeping the blade free of debris. Llano even throws in a spare to swap in and out. Now you get a single foam pad for the V12, while you get the main pad as well as some inserts to accommodate smaller laptops for the V10. And their dimensions as compared to the Cooler Master are as follows. Before we get into the operation, features, and settings, I want to quickly show you guys the difference in ports between the V12 and the V10 models. The V12 features a total of 4 USB ports on the right side of the body, along with the AC power input port. It's got 1 USB-C in for the connection with the laptop, and 3 USB-A out, which have a 30 megabytes per second max. While the V10 also features a total of 4 ports, but they're on the back side of the body, as well as the power input, which I do much prefer because I think it looks cleaner and keeps the dongles and cables better out of sight. And don't expect to run any high-speed cables or video through these pass-through ports, as they're more intended for a mouse, keyboard, and headphone dongles. Also understand that because of the nature of MacBooks' air intake vents, these types of Llano cooling pads aren't going to work as intended. These are best used with Windows work and gaming-focused laptops that have dedicated bottom intake air vents. When it comes to the buttons and general operation, the key difference is that the V12 uses touch gestures and a scroll wheel to adjust the fan speed RPM, while the V10 uses real physical buttons for the RGB mode selections and even for the fan speed as well. I really like both of these layouts, but I'd give the V10 a slight advantage because A, none of these function buttons light up, and feeling your way around in low light is easier with real buttons. And B, the fan speed physical buttons for the V10 give you a bit more precision for micro adjustments, and if you want to quickly move from minimum RPM to max, I can simply hold down the plus and the minus buttons versus continuously scrolling for the V12. When it comes to the cosmetics, you'll notice that the V12 has full 360 RGB lighting, while the V10 RGB is just on the sides and the back. But cosmetics aside, the major benefit for the V12 is that it utilizes a 5.5-inch fan that has a higher power draw versus the V10 that has a fan size of 4.72 inches. In an effort to compensate for the smaller fan though, the V10 can move faster at a max of 3,500 RPM to the V12's 2,800. But we're going to take a closer look at the RPM differences in the performance section. Before we take a look at the temps, I want to give you guys an idea of the noise output at various RPM levels. Now the fan noise is significantly louder when a laptop is not placed on either of these cooling pads, but I'm not going to go deep into the noise level when the laptop is removed from the equation, because I'm assuming you'll simply power off the cooling pad when you're ready to remove your laptop. First and foremost, my Cooler Master cooling pad only has a single fan speed, which is roughly 1500 RPM, and at that level, fan noise doesn't exceed roughly 48.1 decibels, which ironically enough is almost identical to the fan noise output of the V12 at 300 RPM. The V10, on the other hand, puts out a noise level of about 37.2 decibels at 300 RPM and 44.7 decibels at 1000 RPM, both of which are below the V12's lowest setting at that 300 RPM. At 1000 RPM, the V12 reaches about 64.1 decibels, and at 1500 RPM, it comes to 68.5, while the V10 peaks at about 49.1 decibels at 1500 RPM. 2800 RPM for V10 is about 59.1 versus V12's 72.2. So the V10's 3500 RPM turns out to be a bit quieter than the V12's 2800 RPM. Now, after seeing these noise levels across the board for V10, you're probably thinking that it's an easy pick. But take a look at these CPU and GPU temperature graphs for the Legion 9i derived from Cinnabon stress tests. Blue indicates the temperature reached without the aid of any third-party cooling pad. So for example, when the laptop is lying flat on the stock rubber feet, the average CPU temperature was 79 degrees Celsius, and raised using third-party risers or a stand, the average temperature was 72 degrees. But when adding the V10 and V12 cooling pads into the mix, the 9i temp came in under 70 even at the lowest 300 RPM. The V12 achieved a temperature of 64 at 300 RPM versus 66 RPM for the V10 at that same speed level. Naturally, as you crank up the RPM, the cooler both the CPU and GPU benched. But take note that the V12 in most cases outperformed the V10 at the identical fan speed levels, and that my Cooler Master, which again runs at a steady 1500 RPM, was absolutely crushed by the llano pads at the same speed levels. 2800 RPM for the V12 achieved a temp of 60 degrees Celsius, while the V10 at 3500 RPM came in slightly behind at 62 degrees Celsius. I saw very similar CPU results with the Legion 7i as well, but V12 and V10 GPU temps were dead even at 300 RPM, which was 65 degrees Celsius. Though as we move upward through 2800 RPM, the V12 came out on top and narrowly beat the V10 at max 3500 RPM. Similar story with the 7i Cinnabon's GPU stress test, but this time around the V10 and V12 tied at a temperature of 45 degrees for their subsequent max speed levels. I also want to show you guys some peak temps reached for Cyberpunk 2077 with high settings. So unlike the Cinnabon's graphs, these numbers represent peak spikes in temps rather than averages, so they're going to be a little bit higher. The peak CPU temps for the 9i without the use of the V12 or the V10 were in the 80s and the mid to the high 70s for GPU. I also ran these tests for the 7i, and these were the results. And so yeah, without question, these pads do significantly contribute to cooler temps in the short term, day by day in their usage, which in turn can have a positive impact on your overall system health over the life of the device. Look, if you're struggling with high temps, or if you strictly want to play it safe and extend the life of your product, I think these cooling pads are a no-brainer, especially if you're gaming with one of these hotter running Intel CPUs. But there are some things you need to be mindful of if you're in the market. I'd say the biggest drawback of a high-speed laptop cooling pad and USB hub hybrid like the V12 and V10 is that they do require their own dedicated power source. So you can't easily get up and move about as I could with my Cooler Master, for example, which pulls its power directly from the laptop itself. But then again, it'd be impossible to obtain these kinds of fan speeds and performance with a more mobile solution without depleting your laptop battery like clockwork. I do want to make it clear that at higher speeds, as shown in the noise test, these units can and will get loud enough to exceed the volume of your dedicated laptop cooling system. 300 RPM for the V10 and 12 are extremely quiet and in most cases outperform my OG Cooler Master Slim, which runs at a constant 1500 RPM. But just know that 300 isn't going to cut it for all scenarios. Personally, I'd recommend running the V12 between 800 and 1200 RPM for general everyday use for demanding games. But you could also run the fan at lower speeds under 800 RPM and then max the speed out in bursts for minutes at a time. To summarize my thoughts though, when it comes to a direct head-to-head comparison between the V12 and V10, here's the deal. The V10 is quieter at all comparable levels. Even 3500 RPM on V10 is quieter than 2800 RPM on the V12. But because that fan is smaller and has a lower power draw, you do have to run the V10 fan at a higher RPM to achieve similar levels of performance as the V12. But as I mentioned earlier, I do prefer the physical buttons and the backport layout on the V10 versus touch and the side ports on the V12. Another key note is that even though the V10 is being marketed to support 13 to 17-inch laptops, 16-inch laptops and larger are simply going to be a better fit for the V12. If you have any specific questions or follow-ups, make sure to drop me a comment down below, and also be sure to check out the description for any limited time discounts that I may be able to get for you guys. As always, thanks for watching and supporting the channel, and I will see you guys in the next one.